past month, I've had Chord DAVE and Mscaler, well, TT2 as well, in for review. The DAVE was kindly lent to me by one of my patrons, and the Chord lent the Mscaler and the TT2. When I first listened with a DAVE some years ago, I borrowed one for a couple of weeks. I remember plugging in a pair of headphones, hooking it up to my computer, and when I began listening to music, I had a physical reaction to it. I had trouble breathing, and my ideas about what a high-end digital to analog converter would do with the music were completely shattered, as just the sensory overload of what was being reproduced through the DAVE was just, to me, it was like listening to live music, where you actually feel what the singer or the band or whatever, you feel everything that's going on. You're not just seeing it in watching it on YouTube or listening to it through a normal system. You actually could feel it. And that was something I didn't expect at all. So what was going on there? Why does the DAVE give me this reaction, and how does it compare? How does the Mscaler affect it? And how does the DAVE and other chord gear go about doing this, as they are quite unique? And that's what I'm going to explore in this video today. So the DAVE came out before the TT2 and Mscaler. You can see the difference in design. The DAVE is designed to fit into a rack with Bluetooth and other components of the same shape from Chord, and the TT2 and Mscaler came out some years later and have adopted a kind of a more squarish or maybe rectangular shape, as you might call it. And so, as far as digital to analog converters go, they have inputs and outputs. You could just plug it in via USB and then plug one of the single-ended or balanced outputs to an amplifier. We can even use it as a preamp. Or you can just plug in headphones like I did to the front socket and listen that way. But the DAVE has some unique features which are not quite so common, and are maybe fairly unique to the Chord range, in that the BNC inputs we use for SPDIF, there are no RCA versions included. They're 75 ohm connectors for the most optimum experience. There are two of those at least which can be connected as a dual input from the Mscaler or Bluetooth CD player. That means that the Mscaler or Bluetooth can use its full million tap potential and output a 768 kilohertz signal into the DAVE, which the DAVE then uses its own digital filter to reproduce the music with. Now, these DACs have been called, FPGA DACs, and that's not a correct way to describe them. An FPGA is not a digital to analog converter. An FPGA is like if you want to use a kind of real-world analogy, imagine a convention hall. A convention hall is a large space. It has entrances, exits, nothing inside it, but it can be configured with tables, chairs, partitions, and what have you, and arranged to suit, whatever purpose the person renting it wishes to use it for. Now, an FPGA is like the electronic equivalent of that. It has blocks of computing power, gates, which can be arranged into groups and used for computing as required. And they're used in all sorts of devices. You have network, high-end network cards, which are designed with the FPGAs, where all the programming is done on there. It's not a thing where there's any program that comes with it. The program is entirely designed by the programmer. And in this case, the program is one written by Rob Watts, which includes 30 plus years of research into digital to analog conversion and how to do it most optimally. And now the output of that, a 5-bit pulse width modulated signal, goes to a pulse array DAC, which then converts the final signal into an analog one for output. And if you compare that to how a normal DAC works. Now, in the olden days, we'll say 20 years ago, you would have a DAC chip, and all it did is the final conversion. Maybe it only even did it for one channel. And then you'd have a receiver chip or a filter chip, which would receive the input signal, and then it would do the digital filtering on that, oversample it to maybe 8 times, 2, 4, or 8 times, and then send that signal in the correct format to the digital to analog converter for final output. Now, since most DACs have moved to sigma delta types, the digital filtering and the final processing are done on one chip. They're fairly monolithic in that regard. And the things like the DACs used in phones and in some lower end kind of hi-fi gear include the output stage, like a series of op amps or some kind of output stage in the chip, so they can have an all-in-one solution available there. Now, that means you're limited to whatever digital filtering is available on the chips. Well, in both cases, before and after the change to monolithic chips. and the quality of the output stage. And the output of digital to analog converters, and the regular ones, includes a lot of high frequency noise, so that has to be filtered out. So you normally have multiple stages after the DAC chip, so that you want to not only filter out high frequency noise, but increase the power of the signal, because it has to be go over a pair of interconnects to an amp, or go into a headphone amplifier or some such thing. And that's quite complex, and that's one of the things that Rob Watts found was a bottleneck in getting the highest quality sound available. So you'll find in a lot of Chord DACs, people talk about, does it have a line output and a headphone output? They tend to be one and the same, because the circuit doesn't have to have multiple gain stages and filtering of high frequency noise and all that. That's all taken care of by the setup with the FPGA and pulse array DAC. And the result is a very clean and clear signal, and much higher fidelity than is normally available in a regular kind of chip-based DAC. Even though, quite modern R2R DACs, they just can't technically compete on the accuracy that the Chord DACs have. Now, when it comes to listening, of course, we're all limited to the equivalent of about 21 bits of audio resolution, because the noise level of just even individual components is not going to give you better resolution than that. But if you look at the amount of processing power that is applied to the signal, just to give you some kind of comparison, a normal DAC chip might do something like have a few hundred taps, which are used for processing the digital at most. The Rob Watts DACs have in the tens of thousands, going up to 164,000 taps for the Chord DAVE. Now, in a regular DAC, you might have 8 times oversampling or 16 times oversampling. In a Chord DAC, it's 2,048 times oversampling. So it reconstructs the original analog waveform to an extremely high degree. And then when you add an Mscaler or Bluetooth on there, you get another million taps of processing power there to refine things even more. And it's what you end up being reproduced is, if you compare a normal DAC, you think of, like I have this Luxman DAC here, we tend to think of high-end DACs as being, well, okay, I'm listening to a good quality 2-channel recording, let's say a small jazz group, or maybe an orchestra or something. Maybe you hear it, there's an instrument and there's a singer, and in between that there's this kind of blackness, and you think, well, this must be very high-end, that you only hear the instruments, you only hear actually what's going on and no noise. But in reality, that's not how live music sounds. There's always an interaction between all the sounds bouncing around it off from the instruments and singer, and bouncing off everything around them. And in between the instruments, in between what's going on, there is sound coming out as well. And that's what the Dave was reproducing for me. It was reproducing everything that's between the instruments that a normal high-end DAC was actually, in its kind of blackness, was actually not reproducing. That's what that black was between instruments. It was stuff not being reproduced. And having all that information that you do get in a live performance reproduced out through even headphones was just such a shock initially. It actually, again, caused a physical reaction where I was like, oh, this is ridiculous. Just the sensory overload was incredible. And the thing now, I've had the Dave and the Mscaler sitting here for about a month, is that it's become kind of, I'm used to it now. It's like everything else just sounds like, well, there's stuff missing. It sounds like I'm listening to music now. Not listening to the gear and hearing, oh, this has this quality and that has that quality. I really do feel like it's the music coming through. And that was the really sensational thing about the Dave, in that it has this just ability to reproduce the music. And the good and the bad of that has been, well, it's kind of been mixed. So, if I plugged it into, say, various amps, my ALO Audio Studio 6, or the Audio GD Master 10, or even Audio GD's Master 9. And each time you plug it into an amp, you do lose a little bit of that quality versus plugging headphones, for example, direct into the Dave. You do lose a tiny little bit of detail, a tiny little bit of that magic of the sound listening through another amplifier. Maybe the closest I've come is plugging the Dave into the Master 10 and listening with the new Odyssey LCD-Rs, the limited edition ones, and powered out of the Master 10. The experience of listening to, say, classical, my good friend Stefan recommended Don Giovanni, is absolutely sensational. And the thing about that is that because it's designed to reproduce music as accurately as possible, the sound stage you get, especially with speakers, or in the rare kinds of headphones that do reproduce a good soundstage, like the Focal Utopias, you do get a very absolute sense of the soundstage depth and width. There's no kind of compression. It's not like some converters I've listened to where you put DSD through them, for example, and everything sounds flat and just wide but flat. Or you get some soundstage but you can't quite make it out. It sounds, if something is 5 meters back, it's 5 meters back. If it's 1 meter back, it's 1 meter back from the mic. Everything in its absolute position in the soundstage. So if there's so a lot of things like larger recordings, they do very much sound behind my speakers, and my speakers are only about 3 meters away from me at most. And it's very much a case of, stuff comes from behind the speakers. And even again with Focal Utopias as well, direct from the Dave, you do get that sense of pure depth and width in the music. Now the thing is, that's not the most exciting always. Now these of course are designed objectively to be as accurate as possible, but the downside to that is sometimes you might want more you want stuff in your face, you want that engagement. And so some people find that they prefer, for example, like when I talked about IFI Audio's Pro IDSD, sometimes those shorter, if less accurate, digital filters, which are technically, they kind of smear things in the time domain so that your perception of where instruments and things are pushed really far forward in your face. Sometimes that's more fun, if less technically accurate. Sometimes you do want that in your face, and that's one of the aspects of the Dave that I noticed in the Dave and Mscaler. Is it's perfect in many ways, but sometimes you kind of want more. Or sometimes you just want, a little bit of flavor in there, so you do want to put a tube amp or something in there, or, something just between the Dave and whatever, speakers or headphones you have, and kind of, add a little bit of a flavor in there to make, listening more interesting. But the interesting thing is with the Mscaler, I could switch off its upsampling, just by pressing a button. And it's very funny how you have this. When I started with the Dave just by itself, it was just a fantastic experience, listening to it, having all this detail come through it. But adding the Mscaler added more. It added more nuance and more layers. So it wasn't just, I could hear more clearly sound bouncing off the sides of the venue that it was recorded in. But it was almost, you could feel like when the sound came from one instrument, how it bounced off other instruments and how the sounds interacted between the instruments became more apparent. And when you turned that off just by pressing a button, all of a sudden everything kind of went more like pixelated in a sense. Everything was kind of more blocky. There was more block of this and block of that. And then when you turned the Mscaler back on full resolution, then you had all that nuance in between, how the sounds interact in the whole environment started to have like color in it. It was full of this kind of sound color that you got the full picture of what was going on in the environment. It became like a real experience where it wasn't just this and this and this, which is still a little bit apparent even with just the Dave, but it was all the whole sound that you got from everything all together interacting in all directions. A really, really amazing experience. So how about the headphone drive from the Dave? Now, when I first heard the Dave, it was with a pair of Focal Utopias, I think in one of the Tokyo shows, and I was kind of like, yeah, it just, something didn't do it quite for me. Now, it was interesting that at this level of resolution, if I changed any one thing, it would have an effect on my experience. And I felt sometimes that the headphone output of the Dave was sometimes a little bit lacking. Now, it didn't have any trouble driving things like the final audio range of planers. With planar headphones, they're very easy to drive, and even the Focal Utopias are very easy to drive. But I kept feeling sometimes like I wanted a little bit more. The funny thing and probably annoying thing was I experimented with changing whatever I could. And in this case, I just changed a power cable. Now, I'm not going to tell you what power cable I used for various reasons, one being that it's no longer made. And I plugged in one of my other types of power cables, and it's like, oh, that sounds a little bit better. Now, I couldn't put my finger on why, but even with the Mscaler, I switched from going from USB to SPDIF from a Singsa converter, one of the ones I've seen in my previous videos from the Kitsune Tune version. And that something else sounded a little bit smoother and a little bit cleaner. So the thing is, everything that I changed around that fed the Dave seemed to, maybe change or affect the sound very subtly. And it's very hard to tell because I've got so much equipment around that maybe, you know, something is maybe has a little bit more noise coming through power supply than something else, or maybe a little bit of computer noise was coming through the USB that wasn't coming through before. I could hear even the subtle changes between any component I changed, interconnects, headphone cables, whatever. And that was kind of the problem at this kind of level, is that something can be this doesn't feel slightly right, and then you'll just change one component and it will sound better or sometimes sound worse. So the problem is, and I think the best way it was put is from the owner of the Dave itself, is he said that he ended up taking the Dave for granted. It just became the new normal for him, and without it, everything else kind of sounds less clear. Like anything that's regular Sigma Delta DACs, things like say a topping D90, just sounds like flat and dead. The things that weren't really put to shame were things like Shit Audio's Yggdrasil. Sure, there wasn't quite as much clarity, or maybe even with this Luxman DA06, it still sounded good. Still, the tonality of these kind of DACs like that sounded good, but all that kind of really subtle, you know, in between instrument detail was now missing. It still had, you know, the kind of bass character of the sound was still there, but it's just all that ultra fine detail, stuff that you can't put your finger on exactly what it is, but you feel it more than you necessarily kind of can say that is caused by, you know, the sound of the violin bouncing off the piano or something like that. That kind of stuff, which you can't put your finger on, was just missing between those older DACs. Now the funny thing was, just with the Odyssey LCDR setup, I just ran the balanced inputs from the old Bifrost into it, and ran the single-ended from the Dave into the Jotunheim A. And just switching back to the Bifrost, it was like putting wool over the headphones. It was literally, it just sounded like a whole lot of stuff was just missing from the sound. And I really liked the Bifrost, so it was kind of really sad. So now really the experience with the Dave has ruined me. And this is maybe not as a comprehensive review as it could be, because I only had it a month and I was doing multiple things at the same time. But all in all, I can have to honestly say that the experience has ruined me. Is now that I can actually hear music and feel like I'm not listening to equipment, I really got to find some way of buying one. It's just been that much for me. Now the only thing I can't compare it to is a good R2R DAC other than the Yggdrasil, as I didn't have time to organize something like a Holo May to compare. But it'd be interesting to see, because I know some people I know like the R2R DACs better, and I kind of don't know how I would feel having a very high-end R2R DAC here in comparison. What I am going to do is I'm going to do part 2 of this review with the Mscaler, and then I'm going to talk about my experience using the Mscaler versus using, say, HQ Player, and more about the effect on how, say with the TT2 and the Dave and the Hugo 2. So do look out for that part 2 coming soon. As always, thanks to everyone who has helped me out with these videos. It's thanks to all these people that I'm able to do what I do. Do consider, if you do want my buying advice, if you do want some advice about audio in general, become a supporter and I'll happily help you out. And you can also get my impressions of gear in advance, and you get to see the videos in advance and early takes and other things, and be involved in the little community we have of supporters. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.